that vision of having volunteers if there were no boundaries or roadblocks. And so earlier today, somebody had discussed not having volunteers to serve as lifeguards and wanting to go canoeing. So thinking about, those roadblocks in the way, but potentially what could happen if there were no boundaries and no roadblocks. So I appreciate those of you that have sharing, trying to get us in a place to think about what our programs could look like. And so I've got a couple of those that I'm going to share really quick because several of you have contributed to that Slido poll. So let me share. So a few of you said, youth focused volunteers having that broader representation of community, which I think is good having some of the sessions we got to participate in today about being more diverse, being more inclusive, being cooperative and informed, and then having volunteer leaders that serve in a variety of project clubs, spin clubs, workshops and clinics, and allowing youth to have more experiences to find their spark. Also, a program that begins with extensive training, having time to actually train volunteers is huge. I believe being trained properly, the volunteer program could grow. And then open communication and community. So this is really good that we're starting with some of the things, our wish list, and also we've already talked about some of the barriers that are in our way. So I think it's a great time to get started. So this session today is strategies for volunteer empowerment. I'm going to discuss some of the research around empowerment as well as volunteer empowerment, how it contributes to engagement. And because it's the last session of the day, yay me, I think everybody is, I don't know, are we feeling tired? So tell me in the chat, how are you feeling right now after this entire day? I'm kind of inspired still after the Chris Field, talk and talking about those disruptors for good. But tell me in the chat, how are you feeling? Okay, so at least some good folks. It's only 3:20, so we've got some time. Great. All right, so tell me how you're feeling in the chat. All right. Inspired, but lots of info. I know, lots to process. So today we're going to break out in some rooms and talk about some of these strategies for empowering our volunteers, as well as some things in the way when at the volunteer agent and program level, and hopefully that opportunity to converse further with your co-workers can kind of set you on a good path for the evening. So yeah, Miss Ann on the screen. We love Miss Ann. She's also featured in the annual report. I hope you guys have seen it. There was a big volunteer spread. I'm pretty excited about that. Hopefully we can even grow that in the future. So the session agenda, just to kind of lay out what to expect, where I'm going to discuss volunteer empowerment, that definition of empowerment, an overview of some of the current research in the field and the themes that have been pulled out of that research. And then we're going to break out in teams a number of times and discuss those barriers and enablers to empowerment. We're going to look at it from that volunteer perspective. We're going to look at it from that agent or staff perspective, and also from the program level. So some of those barriers and enablers. And then we're going to put those some ideas into action. So if we've identified those enablers and disablers to empowerment, what potential steps or goals do we have and the steps to get there? And so hopefully, we learn a lot from each other through this process. I'm hoping to learn a lot from you, and I hope that you learn a lot. And just some objectives for you. So at the end of the session, you'll be able to describe the elements of volunteer empowerment, those different enablers and disablers at the various levels of analysis, and then develop those strategies for empowerment at those various levels. And before we get started, I just wanted to have everybody put themselves in a really positive, engaged, open-minded position. Oftentimes when I talk to volunteers and agents about service, they reflect on an experience that they've just had. Sometimes it's not a positive experience. And so it says, okay, hey, Catherine, it says I'm an attendee. Am I still showing my screen? Making sure everybody can still see my screen.
You're good, Megan.
Okay, I just got demoted. So I just want to make sure. Okay. So be that collaborative mindset, be open-minded, positive, and engaged in this session. I know that in a virtual world, it's really hard to be engaged. So working in those breakout rooms and those teams, hopefully we can work through some of this material together and learn. All right, so what is volunteer empowerment? So empowerment is defined as having that feeling of a sense of control over your work and having those necessary skills. This is interesting because in the opening activity, the pre-session activity, somebody discussed training and not having the time, to implement that training. And that is essential when it comes to empowerment. And I understand, time is definitely an issue, and it's one of those barriers in our way. Empowered people, it's measured by 4 cognitions. So first you've got meaning, right? Empowered people have this sense of meaning, which means they feel that their work is important to them. They see the value in the service that they're providing that organization, and they care about the services and the mission of that organization and the services they perform. And next, you have competence. So empowered volunteers have this sense of competence. They're confident in their ability to do the work well, and that they know that they can perform those specific tasks that you've laid out for them. This is also important when it comes to competence. Having information to do that role also helps when it comes to competence and competence. And then empowered people have a sense of self-determination. They have the freedom to choose how to do their duties, and they don't feel micromanaged. They can go about their duties with some degree of autonomy and understand that they can't always have full control, but having the ability to make some of those decisions and acting with autonomy is critical when it comes to empowerment. And then there's also impact, which means that people believe they know that they can influence the work of the program that they're involved in, and that those that are in leadership positions are listening to their ideas and allowing them to provide feedback. So those 4 cognitions of meaning, competence, self-determination, impact lead to that empowerment, volunteer empowerment. And why are we talking about empowerment anyway? So this is a concept that I'm obviously passionate about. If you've talked to me, recently or in the past year or so. So I have this wonderful, great visual on the screen and I just want to know who has seen this image before. And when I'm talking about this one right here, who has seen it? Anybody. So in the chat, if you've seen it, say yes. If you haven't seen it before, say no. Who has seen this image? Okay, I've got a million no's. Do I have any yeses? I saw Grant on this call earlier. Ashley, you have seen it. Charles has seen it. I've got 1 yes, and I know 2 others on the call have seen it. So why this is important is that this diagram is on page 2 of the foundational literature on leadership development in 4-H. Okay, so on volunteer leadership development, this is on page 2. It's the very beginning of that document that spells out the ISOCHR method, the one that we use to build our volunteer development program. So I thought I believe, and this is my perspective, that this was intentional of having this visual, this image before the isochur method was laid out. So we've got agent authority of the agent, right? And this is the foundational literature of what we talk about isochur in 4-H. We've got the authority of the agent, and as the authority of the agent gets smaller, authority of the leader gets larger, leader participation also increases. So as the leader gets more opportunities to make decisions, as the agent provides more information to the leader, and the leader gets more autonomy in their role, they get more opportunity to make decisions for their program, their participation grows. Now, this is at the very beginning of isochur, so it was intentional that isochur developed leadership and empowerment in our volunteers. All right, and working along the different methods of identification, selection, orientation, training, utilization, recognition, evaluation. I believe I got them. But the interesting concept of isochur is that it has some foundation in human resource practices. Human resource practices are about controlling employees, whereas when Boyce put this together, it was more about empowerment. However, sometimes when we go about putting those pieces together of our volunteer program, we provide our volunteers with less control and we empower them less, because essentially what we're doing is putting management pieces in place, and management means control, which is very, very interesting. I think it's interesting. So this is in our foundational literature, so we're going to talk about it quite a bit. So effective implementation of empowerment, and you can look at this from the perspective of your volunteers. You can look at it from the perspective, of yourself. When it comes to empowerment, first we need to ask ourselves some essential questions. So first, what we really mean by empowering our volunteers? Well, that means listening to what their needs are. I was reading some literature the other day where there was these volunteer EMTs, and anytime they were in a meeting and somebody said the word volunteer, people just turned off to that, because it felt like, oh, those people were at the bottom of the organization, when in fact they were performing those essential roles, and they were in a situation where the resources that they were using to perform their essential roles were not adequate, and so they were not getting what they needed to perform their essential tasks as volunteers. And so we need to know what the needs are. We need to model that empowerment behavior, and we need to work to develop relationships with our volunteers that help us establish trust. I'm sure that you've had volunteers in your program that you have existing rapport with. It's much easier to trust somebody that you have existing rapport. Sometimes when the trust means it's just because of that lack of relationship that exists. So it is essential that when you're looking to empower volunteers, that you work on developing that relationship and establishing trust. And next, we have to ask, do we really want empowered volunteers? Well, empowered volunteers, they bring more innovation. They bring more of that transformative change we're looking for, because they have less barriers when it comes to, dreaming up that innovation in your program. And what are the characteristics of those empowered volunteers? Well, they have the critical information that we need, and we just looked at that with the Boyce, with the diagram that we have. They know that they have an essential piece of your organization, so they know where they are, and then they know that their role is essential. And they do feel like they're part of a team, and they have access to that training and knowledge they need to perform their essential roles. Now, the next question asked is, how do volunteers develop that sense of empowerment? So that is where you can incorporate those actions where they can see themselves as an essential piece of your organization. So involving them in those critical decision-making processes, asking them for feedback. I'd seen that Pam Pierce had posted a picture recently with her, her volunteers and allowing them to have voices in the direction of her program and collecting that feedback and essential information. That's critical. How do program characteristics facilitate empowerment? That's our next question. Having that clear vision, being open and available to your volunteers, exercising shared power, and providing them with the support they need to perform their roles. And then nextly, and we're going to also visit this when we break out into our rooms, how can we facilitate that empowerment? Well, some of it starts with the change in ourselves. So they often say the change means at the top. Well, you need to look at the way that you're working with your volunteers or mobilizing them a lot differently. Are the actions that you are doing every day, are they empowering people, or are they exercising more control? So some of the research on volunteer empowerment that I've been looking at recently, it's very interesting. So volunteers, and we do know this, they look at their work as a form of leisure. And looking at it as a form of leisure, they prefer having that level of independence, flexibility, and lower levels of control, which is interesting because when we think about volunteer management, it's all about controlling those experiences and the volunteers that we have, where essentially they're participating in something they think of as a leisure experience, and they don't want that extra amount of control. Volunteers are empowered when they're listened to, when they get to help make those important decisions, especially when it's issues that affect them. And they often reject the word volunteer because of where volunteers are placed at the organization. I remember a conversation that I had with Shannon Waits when I first started, and I said, well, what do you call your volunteers? And she said, we don't call them volunteers, we call them leaders. They're lead programs and they're leaders in our organizations. And that stuck with me, throughout my time so far as a specialist, because she understood that essential role that her volunteers are playing in the organization, and they were leaders, not volunteers. And organizations that empower volunteers allow them to work more essential roles. So they might be involved in hiring and even recruiting of staff. Volunteers, they have social capital. They know where people, where the needs are in your organization, and they know where people are in your community that could essentially fill those roles. And volunteers want to see the results of the impact they provide. And that's one of the power of 4-H, is we're allowing volunteers to work directly with youth, so they get to see the change of the youth that they are mentoring and coaching in their various leadership roles. And then if you look at the data on the tenure of volunteers in our program, they see that many of them are serving, 5, 10 plus years. We've had volunteers that have served 30 plus years or more. They get to see the progress over those years of the youth that they're involved in, and that makes our program very, very powerful for them. So before we move into the activity part of today's session, some of the themes of volunteer empowerment that I've been able to pull from the research is those collaborative relationships. The volunteers want relationships with the program, they want relationships with the individuals that they are working with within that program, and they want reciprocity and collaboration. They're looking for informality, so less structure and less control depending on the event and depending on that program. And they're looking for social networks, informal and formal social networks, that connectiveness, the opportunity to network with others. Last year, I worked with the specialists in the region to develop these informal volunteer chats throughout the region. I had a couple of supporters on the call that were like, this is a great idea, let's go for it. And then I had a couple of specialists that were just not having it. They didn't think that something so informal conversation would be something that volunteers wanted to participate in. Well, they were wrong, because registration is over plus 100, every time we have these regional volunteer chats. It's really all about having the volunteers feeling connected and building connections throughout the regions. And there's there's a couple of questions that they respond to, but it's really a lot of just informal conversation because they're looking for those networks and that connectiveness within the program. And then they're also wanting that essential identity. So where they fit in the organization, and they want to know their roles is essential. And then flexibility, if at all possible, being that they're looking at their experience as a leisure activity. If flexibility is ever an option, that is something that helps with empowerment. All right, so we're going to now move into some breakout sessions. We're going to talk about empowerment from the volunteer perspective, the agent perspective, and the program perspective. What we're going to do is, and Catherine's going to help me, we're going to break out, and you guys are going to have 8 minutes to work on these different prompts. And we have some materials that you can reference as you work in your teams. So your first question is going to be, what are the volunteer qualities or factors that enable and disable volunteer empowerment? So at the volunteer level, what are the enablers? And then what are the disablers? And I provided you just a couple of examples. So, knowledgeable about the topic, has an existing relationship with program staff are often identified as enablers. And 2 disablers that were identified were difficult to talk to, so communication barriers and lack of transportation. So working in your teams, respond to these 2 prompts, and you're going to have 8 minutes to do this once we move you into teams. What are those enablers and what are those disablers to empowerment at the volunteer level? And so Catherine has shared in the chat, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you where to find these materials. So you want a room leader, as Catherine has identified, and then I'm going to share a different screen real quick. So in the main room of the conference team, if you click on files, what we've done is we've created a folder called Strategies for Volunteer Empowerment. You click on that folder, right? And your first breakout activity, you'll see that every breakout room will have a guide. So if you're in room 1, click on activity 1. If you're in room 2, 3, 4, click on that and then start generating your ideas in the document. As Catherine has already shared in the chat, you have one person be the leader to report out and then do the recording for your group. So within your teams, identify those barriers and enablers to volunteer empowerment at the volunteer level. Does anybody have any questions before Catherine turns on the breakout rooms? And you have 8 minutes, and we'll send you a 2-minute warning. All right, Catherine, I think we're okay, Catherine. You want to turn them on?
All right, rooms are starting.
Okay.
I don't know what happened, but I ended up back in here.
Oh, we closed the rooms.
Come on.
I didn't get to tell my group bye.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
I didn't either, Megan. I was talking, didn't get to tell them bye.
I'm sorry. I don't like pulling people away from conversations when they're feel free to tell them bye. Okay, so we're back, and it looks like this beyond there being 14 breakouts, and we had 2 we had to make really quick. That's okay. I think it went pretty good. Is there any room that wants to volunteer kind of reporting out on what their thoughts were, what they came up with?
I'll share for group 1.
Do you want me to pull up your document for you?
Yeah, that would be
Okay.
much easier than me trying to pull it up on my laptop. Yeah.
So some of you I was spying on. Group 1 was one of those.
I saw you in there.
All right, give me 1 second.
Okay. Well, I'll start. So, some of the things we talked about for the first one, what are some of the factors that enable empowerment? We said just having an interest in getting involved, the desire to help and work with youth, having experience in other programs. Jennifer had mentioned that we'll get like a lot of students that go to McNeese here in Lake Charles that we're in 4-H in other parishes, so we use them a lot as volunteers because, they grew up in the program and they're familiar with it. Knowing about training opportunities and just understanding 4-H and our organization. We had a little bit harder time coming up with some ones for the second one, but volunteers who have their own agenda or motivation. So volunteers who they want to do something just because it benefits them maybe, and maybe doesn't like benefit everyone or see the whole picture.
Lynette, you had your mic open. I didn't know if you're trying to say something.
No, that was sorry, I hadn't closed it.
Okay. No, those are great thoughts. And so I was looking through some of the disablers as well from some of the other groups. And so lack of resources was a barrier that was also identified. Lack of communication, or so you're giving them information and they're not receiving it. Maybe it's them not actually going and reading that information, or maybe there's a gap in the way you're communicating with them and the way they need to be communicated to. An example being, some of our volunteers don't check email regularly. That's been an issue when it comes, to screening, and an issue that I've had to work with you. So great ideas on those disablers and enablers of empowerment. And so some of these you can start to see as a program or as an agent, allowing them to get that essential training. If there's an opportunity that they can be a virtual volunteer, overcoming that lack of training, working on those different communication gaps. But there are some issues where volunteers are just not ones that are able to be empowered, even if you've employed some of these strategies that we've discussed. So great thoughts. I'm going to move back to this slide. And next, we're going to move you guys back into those breakout groups again, but I wanted to share with you just a few things that recently I had done some research when it comes to enablers and disablers, when it comes to empowerment. And so some of the ones that were identified, and we've talked about having that flexible work schedule, having that educator background, having expertise in that specific area, previous experience, so having the long tenure with 4-H and the transportation and resources and the technical skills needed, as well as the training. And then you just look at those different barriers. Well, if they, not having those relatable experiences, not having the training or the skills or the resources, and then sometimes being new to the 4-H program, it's harder for us to empower them or give them power because, one, we don't trust them as much, with those programs. They don't have the necessary skills yet. We can change that by providing them training, but they've got to kind of learn their role, and that does take time. So great thoughts. So next, we're going to move on and we're going to talk about those agent and staff. And some of you started working into this already with that other activity, but what are the agent staff qualities or factors that enable or disable empowerment. So at the agent or staff level, the factors that enable empowerment, and then the qualities that disable empowerment. And I provide you a couple examples of those within your teams as well. So we're gonna break you out again in their groups, and you're gonna spend 8 minutes talking about those enablers and disablers of volunteer empowerment at the agent and staff level. So Catherine, you can go ahead and get those rooms, and it's the same process. The activities in your folder. 12 rooms, Catherine.
Oh, sorry, it's already 14, but I already doubled the activity things.
Well, that's fine then. They're good. Thanks for your help. Appreciate it.
Catherine did it again. I didn't get to tell anybody bye.
No.
I gave you a warning in the chat. Did you not see my warning?
We were busy. We're not paying attention to your chats, okay?
2 minutes goes by really fast.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Hilton. All right. So is everybody back, or are we still funneling back in? Got a couple of people with mics open. All right, who wants to report out this time? Any room that wants to volunteer on what they?
I'll report what we discussed. So some of the things that we found that enabled empowerment,
Megan,
trusting.
What room are you in?
Room 2.
Okay, I'll pull that. You can talk and I'll pull it up. So.
Okay, so some of the things that we found that enabled empowerment was entrusting them with tasks, even the small ones, just to start building confidence. And they were also willing to give control to others. And then some things that disable empowerment, having the expectation of things being done a certain way, not willing to really change. And then also, if you have a hard time handing over responsibilities, that can, disable empowerment.
Right, and just wanting that sense of control, and I get that. In our roles right now, we want those experiences to be meaningful and successful. So, that's sometimes very hard to do. So, great thoughts. Anybody else want to share anything from their breakout?
I'll go. This is Shannon. We were in room number 12.
Okay.
We talked about some enablers, and again, this is kind of just how it is. If you're from the area that you're working in and you know the needs and the people in that community already, it's just innately easier to enable that empowerment. It also seems easier to recruit and work with volunteers in areas that the agent is comfortable with. So if you're versed in a certain project area, you're going to be a little bit more comfortable with allowing volunteers to work in that area if you know that they're also competent and interested. So again, that's kind of a natural thing. Some of the things we talked about that are disablers, or the fact that we have so many programs going on at all times that we sometimes have a lack of sufficient planning time to be intentional about it. And also, and we all have them, those people who are difficult to communicate with, or just who communicate differently than you, we have a tendency not to loop those people in sometimes. Just again, human nature. If we don't connect with someone, it's easier for us to overlook them and choose someone else maybe. And then agents sometimes know the program so well that they forget the important steps in volunteer development and training, and sometimes that gets overlooked. And if a volunteer isn't comfortable or trained adequately, then the success of the program might be at stake. So those were our thoughts.
So great, really great thoughts, Shannon. I appreciate that, and both groups, Megan as well. So a lot of the themes too, like that, not having adequate planning. So we talked in the beginning about not having time, and then also that essential component of training, providing that professional development, and the resources and training needed to perform those tasks, and not having it is a clear disabler. So very good thoughts. That communication also came out as well in both groups. So being that effective communicator, collaborator, and I think it's okay to understand that some individuals are easier for us to communicate with than others, and there may be gaps in the way that we communicate. I used to always say you have to learn the love language, of the particular volunteer, and we are definitely in working with volunteers that have their different love language. So the way, we need to communicate with them. Not all of our volunteers use their email. Some of them don't have smartphones. Or when it comes to the words that we choose and the way that we communicate, sometimes it's easy just to misinterpret. And I think we also talked about that on another session today. So lots of very good thoughts. So we have about 20 minutes left, and we have one more breakout activity, which I think is critical, that we're going to move into. And so I'm going to we'll move into that in just a moment. But the last level of analysis that we need to look at, Charles shared in the chat, so I'm going to, Megan, room 7 should be the next great room. Okay, great. Charles said communication came up in both an enabler and disabler and how efficient they are used. So very, very good thoughts. This one is important. It's important for me as a specialist. It's important, for you as an agent. It's important for administration. Program elements that enable and disable empowerment. Okay, so those enablers, that consistent ongoing training that you're able to tap into for your leaders or able to provide. Leader autonomy. Disablers, those lack of communication channels altogether. We've already talked about that a couple of already at the agent level, but potentially at the program level, and then lack of training are just some examples. So program elements that enable and disable empowerment. And Catherine is going to move you guys back out into those breakout rooms. Same process.
Hi.
You didn't get me that time. I told them all bye.
So the announcement wouldn't go through. Oh, you figured it out. Oh, okay, we're good. So, okay. I thought I was going to be in trouble because Catherine said the announcement wouldn't go through. So, good deal. I think, is everybody back? Looks like it. Almost. All right. So, yep, everybody's here. So who wants to report out on program elements that disable and enable empowerment? Any groups that want to share?
Group 5 can share.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry. All right. So Charles and I were both in Group 5. So let's see. Program elements that enable. So here's our list. Consistency in programming. So keeping a structure that works. They get comfortable because it's familiar and they know what to expect. So not that they can't change roles, but when they get comfortable and they learn what to do, that can enable them. Another enabler is job description to understand role. Another one is ongoing communication. Another one is variety of delivery modes, having a choice of activities so that they can find a place to fit if they do want to fit into your program. And also growing with the volunteer, offering them new opportunities as they develop and grow. And they can even become a middle manager to train the other volunteers. And then we also came up with a list of disable. One could be time constraints. So this includes we need to be intentional to include them in planning, not just giving them a job real quick when they show up. And also being respectful to their other time commitments, which they may have other things they need to go do after your event. So be respectful of that. And another disable would be not giving volunteer feedback. And the last one is there could be some challenges with, or some have found challenges with volunteer screening with school teachers. Charles was saying it kind of happened into the school year a little bit, and they're having to take that extra step because they've already been screened. And so we need for them to understand why we need it. So it's just like training on why we have certain policies. And that's it.
Oh, those are great. That's a very good list. And a lot of those themes were the themes that I also discovered, through the research. So lots of good thoughts that volunteer training provided and available. So lack of training, lack of communication, and these are the difficulties of empowerment. Agent turnover was one identified that I'm not sure we mentioned, and other rooms might have mentioned. That lack of trust was mentioned. Overwhelmed by policies and procedures, and screening is also included in that. That being a risk averse or afraid to take a risk, and then not having those skills to develop those relationships with your volunteers, and then some of those enablers having that identified training and professional development, rewards and recognition, which you all also mentioned, Heather, as well, and clear and open communication channels, that sharing of critical program information, so social networks and potentially informal social networks, mechanisms for feedback, and feedback's a two-way street, right? So providing them evaluation and allowing them to evaluate your program, and then flexibility if ever possible. So a lot of great ideas. We have 5 minutes left, so we talked about a lot of these enablers and barriers at the volunteer level, at the agent level, and the program level. So what are we going to do with this information now that we've spent over an hour talking about it? So taking these last 5 minutes, I want you to develop an action plan, and we don't have to provide, I'm not going to spend an hour with you developing a long list, but I want you to identify one change that you can make to enable empowerment at that volunteer agent level, all right, in an action step that you'll take for that change. And then I want you to identify one change at the program level, and then an action step for that change. And then I want you to contribute that as part of the reflection, all right? And so I'll just give you an example. So at the program level, critically, we need some of these training modules redesigned on, the learn.lsu.eggcenter.com. That is critical. That is one thing that we need in that action step, is we have a committee working on redesigning those modules in a way that they're more engaging and more easier to access, and then for our volunteers. So that's something that we're working on. We're working with a great software called Articulate. We have an awesome team that's redesigning those. That's right now, it's a barrier to engagement as well as empowerment. That is one of the things that I'm doing as part of my role as a state specialist. So action steps. So if you could contribute to the Jamboard one change at the agent volunteer level, and then one at the program level. And Catherine has shared that in the chat. Whoops. And then as you guys are thinking and claim that Jamboard, you'll pull up your thoughts. Okay, so we've already got a couple and they're really great. So I'm just going to share the screen as you guys contribute your ideas in these last few minutes today. So developing out, and then if you need more space, feel free to flip to another board. We've got develop better relationships with volunteers by establishing a monthly chat. Well, that's neat. Seeking out volunteers for more diverse audiences, encouraging new ideas. Oh, I love that. I love it. Showing more appreciation for our volunteers and love to work together with you on that. Expanding our volunteer pool using not using the same ones over and over. And then having, the same concept, just not depending on a few. And then at the program level, having that more consistent volunteer training, which I hope to contribute to. Developing systems of awards, acknowledging other positive feedback for volunteers, very, very good. Helping volunteers see that their role is essential, developing clear positions and titles. So lots of really great ideas that y'all are contributing in. And if you've never used the Jamboard, it's a really easy way to capture ideas from members or your volunteers. You just click that sticky note icon on the side, type it, something in, and then hit save, and it posts it to the board for you. So feel free to keep sharing. Lots of great ideas. And as we're wrapping up, hold on one second. All right, well, I hope y'all continue to contribute to that Jamboard. I'll share it in the post-session materials too. Catherine, am I sharing my resource tree? So references, if you want to participate, if you want any of these references, I will share them with you. Feel free, I'll ask, I'll send you electronic copies. But thank you all for participating in this session, being so open-minded, objective. The information that you developed today helps each other, but it also helps me as well in my role, because I need to know what the needs are and the barriers and enablers that exist. So thank you all so much, and enjoy your evenings. And look at me on time, 4:01. So I'm excited about that. So y'all have a great night. Thank you.